Ann Jarboe Russell has written a compelling biography of Lady Bird Johnson. In this book, Russell has unraveled some of the mysteries of who has been ignored by historians. The book is Lady Bird in all phases of her life. Her early years in East Texas, orphaned by the death of her mother and raised by her father, a successful businessman. The early independent college years in Boston. Her marriage to Linson and her prowess as a business acquired wealth for the Johnson clan. Portrait of the mother who was rarely there for her daughters, and the wife who looked the other way as her husband publicly betrayed her. Through all the ambiguities, Russell perceives Lady Bird as a product of environment and time, but also with tremendous talent and endurance despite the adversity. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule, which is going to get very, very busy weeks to come, go around the country, and you promote this wonderful bird. And what I have to tell you, I'm sure the audience is that I do have to possibly read every single word of this one, because it just took me. It's delightful reading. You were easy on the eyes. You told the story about someone who has intrigued me, and I think intrigued a lot of people. Later, I have to ask you that first.
Well, I grew up in Texas, and for me, Lady Bird Johnson was the embodiment of what a Texas woman was. And at times I've liked that particular embodiment, and at times I haven't. But it's me that there was no more important figure as a woman in modern day Texas, in 20th century American life, than Lady Bird Johnson. And to my shock, she really hadn't been looked at before. And I had a lot in common with her, and I think, which took 4 long years, extremely helpful. And so she reminded me of my mother, of my grandmother. She was like a template of the women that in East Texas, where I grew up. Later, when I went on my travels as a journalist, Texas and South Texas, she's just a few garden club, any garden club in Texas. And you looked around the room, quarters of the women in the room are going to look like Lady Bird Johnson, talk like Lady Bird Johnson, and have her particular values. In a way, this book is a book about how they are, the way they are, and why a particular generation of it, of Texas women.
Okay. We're going to spend a lot of time talking with you about Lady Bird. We're going to do, this show is going to take up 2 shows. And so before we plunge into the book itself, I want to talk a little bit about writing, and there may be people in the audience. One gets to the point where one has a biography published by a major publishing house, excerpted in 2 major national magazines. We should tell the audience that it is going to be excerpted in Texas Monthly, as well as George. How fitting is JFK's George magazine. How did you get started writing? Were you always a writer?
I grew up in the piney woods of East Texas, not very far from where Mrs. Johnson was born herself, and lived a very geographically limited life. And there were 2 things to do: read and go to church. And I did those 2 things. My father was a minister. That was good because we had access to a lot of books through the church. And so I was a big, of course, reader before I was a writer. I always wanted to be a novelist, but my father told me that I would starve to death and said that I had to become a journalist. So in 1969, I went to Texas, majored in journalism. I was desperate to get to work on a newspaper. I did. And first I worked at a newspaper in Georgia, and during the civil rights, I was very interested in all of that. I was at the University of Texas when the anti-war movement was really at its height, and I was a student newspaper reporter on the Daily Texan. So I actually had a face-to-face meeting with President Johnson as a student at the University of Texas, a meeting I have never forgotten, because to be in his physical presence was very different than to read about him, and I was grateful for that. But anyway, so I then came to work at the San Antonio Light in 1973, and I covered everything in San Antonio and enjoyed that a whole lot, and finally got a job in 1914 as a writer. I really believe life really began, the narrative writing, things that have beginnings, middles, and ends. But I did support myself. My dad was right. So I have always supported myself as a journalist. And then in 1994, I did a cover story for Texas Monthly about Lady Bird Johnson. And I spent 10 hours with her. I knew that I had my book because everything she said was so important and so fresh. I never read it any before. And so I knew that I had a good book proposal, and I went off and did a proposal, and Scribner accepted it. 4 years later, just like that.
How wonderful. How wonderful. And I have to tell you, it's written for people who think they might be interested in biography as a genre. It's very readable. There's nothing that, if you like a good story, it is her story. Even though the story is true, it makes it no less interesting than maybe a piece of someone might pick up. It's wonderful reading. Let's begin with her story. She was born into fairly prosperous circumstances. Her mother really had an axe to grind. His father-in-law with good impetus for him to become a producer, be married into a family that had, he himself had none. Talk about her roots a little bit.
Well, Lady Bird is a Faulknerian figure. She comes not really from Texas, but from the South, and specifically Alabama. And those of us in Texas know that anybody that did come to Texas in 1918, East Texas is primarily a southern part of Texas, while those of us that live in San Antonio identify the West. But Lady Bird's both sets of her grandparents lived in a little county in Alabama. Her mother's people were landed and owned all of the stores, and her father's people were extremely poor, were fishermen and hunters. They barely lived. And so this made for stress in the relationship between Lady Bird's parents. They were from different classes in a society where class mattered very, very much. I went to Ottawa, Kansas. I looked in the bill progress and found that they had carried a notice of Mrs. Wedding, and in it, her father, T.J. Taylor, was a good old boy from Ottawa County. Mother, Patillo, was described as from one of the finest families in the county. And there was a lot of tension between the two early in the marriage because of that. The specific reference to Taylor and to her grandfather, Patillo, is that Mr. Taylor, who was her father, made him an image of her mother's father, maternal grandfather. And he was racist, and he weighed everybody out of the world in those years, in the 1860s, were. And they made their living off the sweat of black people's brow and accumulated huge debts. People became tenant farmers on their land. And when Taylor came to East Texas, he bought up a whole lot. First of all, he opened a store that said T.J. Taylor, dealer in everything, and then slowly started hiring people to be tenant workers. White people in Karnak as a sign of respect, but the black people called him boss, because by the time he had been over 30 years, the whole slavery system socially was still in place. And so they arrived there together, TJ and Minnie, and it was stressful because the new Mrs. Taylor was very dreamy and rich, and her husband was very crude and poor. She had a very lonely exile, Lady Bird's mother. I think Lady Bird's mother is key to her quality, and she had I think a very sad life.
She didn't have her mother very long. What do you think? There was something special about their relationship. Her mother died very early in the distance, but talk a little bit about the special nature of the relationship, what kind of mother Minnie was to her daughter.
Well, she was her only daughter. She had two brothers, and Minnie was a woman. She ordered first edition books from New York. She went to Chicago to Effie. She was. It's from her that Lady Bird gets her love of flowers. She had a Save Society in Karnak, Texas, in the early 1900s, where she partitioned off a portion of her husband's land and wouldn't let hunters hunt on it because she wanted to. So she was a little bit of an early environmentalist. The people of the county thought she was a kook. She also suffered from terrible migraines, and so she wore enormous veils, white veils, cover around her hat. Told me that they called this that made her look like she had to die, and hats on top of that. And she had a chauffeur and a car, and so she would go through the woods of East Texas with the red earth just flying all behind her, and go on these long rides in nature. And so she was a nature lover and a little bit of a kook. She read mystics, and people thought she was quite strange. She also early suffragette, proponent of the women's right to vote, which, as her granddaughter said, nothing could have ever made Minnie happier than to find that her daughter not only would vote, but would campaign in national political office, and one day be First Lady, because Minnie wanted nothing more than to be able to. And I do think that is part of where Mrs. Johnson derives her own political ambition, separate from Lyndon Johnson. Her mother campaigned against a man for county commissioner who was a slacker, is what they called him. He had not gone to war, and her father had forbade her mother from doing it, but she did it anyway, and her candidate won. So she must have had some influence in the county.
And I think also, and we're going to end right here for this portion, but I think also it shows the really independent spirit of her. And we'll talk more about her mom and her when we come back in just a minute.
Thanks.
We resume our interview with Jan Jarboe Russell about her new book, Lady Bird, a biography of Mrs. Johnson. Jan, we're going to pick up at the point where, sadly enough, Lady Bird loses her mother at 5 years of age.
5 years old, and that's something that she had in common with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think the fact that she was a motherless child just lived with her forever. After that, she was raised by her spinster aunt, Effie, who she was completely invalid. She had, I think, a hypochondriac. She also suffered from the depression and from what her mother did. But unlike her mother, Effie was not. And Lady Bird cared for her the rest of her life. And so instead of Effie raising Lady Bird, it was Lady Bird raising Effie, which was good training for raising Johnson, because you would have had to have been a caretaker to be the wife of Lyndon Johnson.
Health-wise, I think it was Aunt Effie that accompanied her. A little sideline in American history. They went to the spa that was put together by Kellogg.
By this guy Kellogg in Battle Creek, Michigan.
Later became
Kellogg cereals. And one of the thought about Lady, she's sort of this secret health nut, because she did go to the spa at Battle Creek, and her earliest memories are of this cherubic, very fat guy talking about eating no meat and importance of daily bowel movement, exercise. And she was the only child at Battle Creek, and there were all of the captains of industry,
people with
very
her.
Famous people. She ever ate with finger bowls, and she got judges and all of that. But that kind of eating for life, and it's the forerunner of food craze today. So in respect, Miss Johnson was way ahead of the.
I just never, that surprised me when it surprised me in the biography, because I never expected that Lady Bird. And again, it wasn't something that she trumpeted, but it was something that for the rest of her life.
Her life.
Aunt Effie was someone who encouraged Lady Bird to do independent things. She's a very conscientious student. She eventually makes her way to T. Austin. She takes not 1 but 2 degrees. Lady Bird, the student, the striver, and what her aspirations were at the point in her life.
All of her remembrance that she was the girl that they knew. And I think that from Effie, because Effie was a spinster herself, minister at the Juilliard School in New York, and she had a broader life for Lady Bird than East Texas, what many wanted, urging her down this unbeaten path, being a journalist. She wanted her to be a drama critic of the New York Times. She wanted her to go to Washington and work on the... So she was getting this steady shove it from Epi, don't if the subtext men are bad, and because the trouble had gone on in the marriage of Lady Bird's parents. So, the city of Texas, the wealthy kid in the Depression, but the only one that had a car, and smart as she could be, incredibly ambitious. She went through the University of Texas, graduated cum laude with not one but two, and also having managed to rack pretty good social. One of the things that's interesting is Johnson's biographers, sort of dumpy, shy wallflower, who never got out the truth. Hated the president of the student body of the university. She had a lot of dates. She had more dates. She went to Mecca on a double date and stayed up all night across the border, drinking and dancing her way in, from bar to bar. It's not true. It was a wallflower. She had many beaux, and Lyndon Johnson, but she was looking, all of those that I talked to that are still alive, that the two qualities that Lady Bird was looking for in a husband were ambition and perseverance. And those were the qualities that she, Lyndon Johnson, in the fall of 1934, when the two met.
And talk about whirlwind. It happened very, and that time in her life, when she's in college, that her life was quite wonderful. She had a roadster of her own and drove around and drove her friends around, and she had quite a lot of freedom. We also get the sense, though, too, that she wasn't a wild child, and there were some girls who left home and they were wild when they got away. She had good sense. She had a good time, but she had good sense.
One of the details that I think says a lot is that she was invited to join. This shows you that she had a little political crack before it was fashionable. She was joining a sorority, and she initially told those girls she would join the sorority, but her father didn't want her to do it, and later she didn't like it, and she decided against. So the point is that studious, her grades were good, and she wasn't exactly a goody two-shoes either. She was, go out to the hill country at night and have a few drinks with friends, and she took friends home and where they drank whiskey out of mason jars, Texas. So this image of Mrs. John, a person who's never done anything except be mannered with her loves, is really not true.
A short period of time when he popped the question. And he not only popped the question, but he only got a short period of time to answer him. And we get the sense that if she says no, he's moving on real quick.
It's moving on.
And she is the third individual young woman who of the same background. He was definitely looking for a young woman of means. He himself came from a poor family. He was looking to marry into money. She was the third suitor, she was the third such date that he had.
Dora, if she was looking for ambition, he was looking for wealth. And, marriage is a complex contract. And he had what she wanted, and she had what he wanted, too. She was well-mannered, from a good family, and she was rich. And he did. This was his third girlfriend. He'd only dated rich girls in Johnson City. And so from that standpoint, he did, in fact, pursue her. Some people have said that he, in fact, married her for the money. I don't believe that. I believe that he would not have married her if he didn't love her. And the love letters that he wrote to her when he was in Washington and she was back home at the Brick House in Karnak just sound absolutely forlorn. He was at one of the things I think we do to our politicians, especially our presidents, is we deny they have an emotional life. And in fact, they are an emotional species. Nobody runs for president or runs for public office unless they are just driven by a variety of complex emotions. Lyndon Johnson was extremely emotional. And as you say, he proposed to her on the very first date. And as she did, he just gave her an ultimatum: marry me or forget it. And she, even though she was sensible, was turned by this guy. And so she, of how turned her head was, she told me that when the first date they drove down to the King Ranch, and they could have spent the night in a Corpus Christi hotel. And she very carefully said they had separate bedrooms and that Lyndon showed her the door. I was pretty amazed that Claudia Taylor would have gone to the King Ranch with a person she hardly knew, and checked into a motel with him and spent the night in the rooms, feeling totally gaga over him. And I think that the letters reflect that instant attraction between the two of them, but also reflects the fact that Lyndon Johnson was going to be in control of this situation, and no matter what, the focus was going to be on him. And that was true of their entire marriage.
And you see, there is definitely, she was a young girl who was raised with a very strong daddy.
Right.
Very commanding father. You can see that this man who literally came in and commanded her life from the very beginning was, in some ways at least, a replay of what she had known as a child anyway. She came from a very strong daddy. She married a man who was very, very, very strong, very determined to remain the master. But yet, and some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next show that we do on Lady Bird, yet she managed to really eke out quite an impressive array of accomplishments on her own. One thing before we leave, some of the sad parts of her life. I had no idea Lady Bird had 3 miscarriages prior to her first successful pregnancy.
She did. She tried and tried to get pregnant, and this was going on at a time when Lyndon Johnson was having an affair with Alice Glass, the mistress of the publisher of the Austin American Statesman. Now, whether or not I don't know what causes miscarriages, but some of her friends wondered if, in fact, the stress had not contributed to the miscarriages. Mrs. Johnson said that she had a medical problem that was taken care of in a Baltimore hospital, and that when it was taken care of, she was able to have Linda first and then Lucy. But she also admitted to me how psychologically damaging it was to have those miscarriages. That she said, I think that her exact words was that she felt like a failure as a woman, as so many of us who are women who have had trouble having children do. So much of your identity is wrapped in first the wife, mother. And so it was an extremely physically exhausting time in her life, challenging because she was fighting this competition from Alice Glass, and also just very exciting because then finally the girls arrive and she's managed to keep the marriage together to live to fight another day.
Okay. And we're going to come back. We're going to talk again tomorrow. And I want to thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to hearing more about Lady Bird tomorrow.
Thanks.
Okay.